There's a dynasty you've never heard of that made the Sacklers look small. A family that didn't just profit from addiction. They scaled it, engineered it, and turned an entire nation into a captive market. The Sacklers, the architects of OxyContin, wrecked hundreds of thousands of American lives and walked away with $20 billion before anyone intervened. But a century earlier, another family ran the same playbook on a scale 10 times bigger. They hooked millions. They erased generations. They reshaped the economy of Asia. And when the damage was done, when the bodies were counted, they didn't face trials. They received knighthoods. They got monuments. They had their names etched into hospitals and universities because that's how drug empires survive. You make your fortune breaking people, then you wash it with philanthropy. And by the time anyone understands what you did, you're too respectable to touch. This is the story of the Sassoon family, the opium dynasty that helped build modern India, drained China, and walked away admired. And if you think this is ancient history, if you believe we learned anything, check your medicine cabinet. The names have changed, the substances changed, but the strategy is identical, only bigger. So let's go back to 1832. A Jewish merchant clan flees Baghdad, escaping a governor squeezing them for money, threatening prison, or worse. David Sassoon, the patriarch, moves his family through Iran and studies his next move. He sees British India, specifically Bombay, a colonial port exploding with trade. Cotton flowing out, silver flowing in, and the British East India Company operating with total impunity and limitless appetite. Here's the critical part. The East India Company wasn't a company in the modern sense. It was a corporate empire. It had an army, courts, laws, and territory larger than Europe, all serving shareholders in London. By the 1830s, it ruled India through private conquest, seizing kingdoms and monetizing an entire subcontinent. And its most profitable product wasn't cotton or tea, it was opium. David arrives with almost nothing, but he has the only assets that matter. Connections, a Middle Eastern merchant network built by his father, Baghdad's chief treasurer. These weren't casual ties. They were family bonds, religious bonds, trust you can't buy. In a world where contracts meant little and betrayal was common, that network was worth more than money. And he had knowledge. He understood court politics, trade routes, and the anatomy of power. His father's post in Baghdad taught him how officials think, how systems move, and, most importantly, how to make yourself indispensable to the people who run them. And his timing was perfect. He arrived just as the British were solving their biggest economic crisis by turning India into a state-backed narcotics complex. But timing alone doesn't build an empire. You need to recognize what you're looking at. And David Sassoon saw it instantly. The British had engineered a criminal operation wrapped in legal protection, and there was space for anyone who could execute the dirty work cleanly. Here's the backdrop. Britain was obsessed with Chinese goods, tea, silk, porcelain. By the early 1800s, British households drank tea daily. It wasn't luxury, it was routine, and every ounce came from China. But China didn't want British products. Not wool, not machinery, nothing. They already had superior goods. So when British merchants arrived demanding tea, China demanded silver, and silver poured out of Britain by the millions of pounds each year. The deficit was catastrophic. Some estimates put the loss at 8 million pounds of silver annually, hundreds of millions in modern terms. The empire was bleeding metal. Britain tried everything. Exporting manufactured goods, ignored. Negotiating better terms, rejected. China refused everything. Diplomatic missions went nowhere. The Qing court didn't see Britain as a partner. They saw it as a minor tributary state. So Britain faced a dead end. They needed Chinese goods. China didn't need British goods, and the silver drain didn't stop. This became an existential crisis. If it continued, Britain's entire monetary system was at risk. So they designed a solution, one of the most predatory economic strategies in history: turn India into an opium factory. Cover the countryside in poppy fields under British supervision, then flood China with the product. Create millions of addicts, replace trade with dependency. And suddenly, instead of demanding silver for tea, Chinese addicts were handing silver back to British merchants for opium. The deficit flipped. Britain prospered. India became a narcotics plantation. China collapsed into widespread addiction. And there's no ambiguity here. The British engineered a drug epidemic intentionally. They knew exactly what opium did. European doctors prescribed tiny medical doses because they understood its power. They knew dependency, physical breakdown, and death followed mass consumption. They did it anyway because the numbers worked. By 1830, British India was producing over 1,500 tons of opium a year, almost all headed for China. The East India Company controlled every link in the chain, licensing farmers, buying raw product, refining it, boxing it, and auctioning it to shippers. They profited at every stage: licensing fees, processing fees, auction revenue, taxes. By the 1830s, opium made up around 14% of British India's revenue. 1 out of every 7 rupees funding colonial administration, roads, schools, armies, officials, came from drugs. This wasn't a back alley operation, it was state policy. And this is the machine David Sassoon stepped into. He saw it instantly for what it was: the chance of a lifetime. But here's what made the Sassoons different from every other merchant chasing the same profit. Most traders bought opium at auction and shipped it to China. Middlemen, replaceable. David understood that if you want an empire, you don't join the system, you take control of it. Within a few years, the Sassoons dominated the trade, not through violence, not through coercion, through logistics, networks, and total vertical integration. They didn't just sell opium, they owned the pipeline. They financed cultivation in India, lending to farmers so poppies replaced food crops. They owned the warehouses at the ports. They built their own fleet so no shipment depended on outsiders. They ran the insurance that covered those voyages, creating their own insurer to keep every margin inside the family. They placed agents from Kolkata to Canton, people who spoke local languages, understood the markets, and could navigate both British and Chinese officials. And most importantly, they had Britain's blessing. The Sassoons weren't rebels. They didn't oppose the system, they embodied it. They became the perfect collaborators for an empire that wanted the profits while keeping its hands technically clean. When British officials needed something executed, the Sassoons delivered. When funding was required for colonial projects, the Sassoons provided it. When the government needed someone trustworthy for sensitive trade, the Sassoons stepped in. It was a symbiosis. The empire gained a private merchant class to expand its drug economy without direct fingerprints. The Sassoons received protection, legal status, and access to the most lucrative market on the planet. It was the perfect alliance, and it made both sides enormously wealthy. By 1836, the Sassoon Company was shipping around 30,000 chests of opium to China each year. Each chest weighed more than 100 pounds. Millions of pounds of narcotics flooding Chinese ports annually, and the scale kept rising. By 1840, 40,000 chests. By 1850, 50,000. By the late 1850s, nearly 60,000. More than 7 million pounds of opium a year, all aimed at one destination, China. Entire coastal regions began collapsing under addiction. Families disintegrated. Fathers smoked themselves into oblivion while their children starved. Workers became too dependent to function. Shops shut down because owners were too addicted to run them. Farms failed as laborers spent wages on drugs instead of food. Productivity crashed. The Chinese government watched its society and economy unravel in real time, and the silver China had accumulated for centuries flowed straight back into British and Sassoon hands. Every ounce Britain had once lost buying tea now returned through opium. The deficit reversed. Britain won. Millions of Chinese paid the price. This was the first industrial-scale narcotics operation in modern history, and it wasn't run by criminals. It was run by businessmen with British honors operating entirely within colonial law. David Sassoon wasn't hiding. In Bombay, he was celebrated, funding synagogues, donating to charities, building schools. Locals saw a benefactor. The British saw a model colonial partner, proof that their system worked. But China saw something else, a nation being hollowed out, a population enslaved to a foreign drug, silver draining away, an economy collapsing. China finally tried to stop it. In 1839, the emperor appointed Lin Zexu to shut the opium trade down. Lin was incorruptible, sharp, and fast. He arrived in Canton, the epicenter of the trade, surrounded the foreign warehouses, and demanded every chest of opium be surrendered. When merchants resisted, he didn't flinch. He seized more than 1,400 tons from British and American traders and destroyed it publicly, mixing it with lime and salt and dumping it into the sea. It was a message. China would no longer tolerate being poisoned. Lin then sent a letter to Queen Victoria, respectful, direct, and devastating. He asked how Britain could justify selling a drug in China that Britain itself tightly controlled. Why was it acceptable to flood Chinese cities with a substance British society treated as dangerous? Why poison one population but protect another? Britain's answer was war. Not because China violated a treaty, none existed, but because destroying that opium meant destroying British property and threatening the entire economic design. If China could truly enforce a ban, the silver flow would stop. The empire would bleed again. So Britain deployed gunboats, 16 warships against a Chinese military that hadn't fought a modern naval battle in decades. It wasn't a contest. British steamships outgunned and outmaneuvered everything China had. They smashed defenses, blockaded ports, and forced negotiations. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842 was brutally one-sided. China paid 21 million silver dollars. It opened 5 ports to British trade. It ceded Hong Kong permanently. It granted British citizens extraterritorial rights, immunity from Chinese law. And although the treaty never explicitly legalized opium, it didn't need to. With ports opened and British access guaranteed, stopping the trade became impossible. The flood resumed, and the Sassoons, who had backed Britain with ships, resources, and money, were first in line to expand into the newly opened markets. With new ports open, the Sassoons expanded fast. The opium flow surged from about 50,000 chests in the 1840s to over 70,000 in the 1850s, more than 8 million pounds a year. China was being systematically saturated, and the Sassoons sat at the center of it. But China didn't give up. In the 1850s, officials tried once more to enforce anti-opium laws in the treaty ports, arresting dealers, seizing shipments. Britain saw this as a treaty violation and responded the same way it had before, with force. The Second Opium War began in 1856. This time, France joined in, eager for its own share of concessions. British and French troops crushed defenses, marched inland, and occupied Beijing. They burned the old Summer Palace, one of China's greatest cultural treasures, looting what they wanted and destroying the rest. It was cultural erasure on a national scale. When China surrendered, the Treaty of Tientsin legalized opium outright. For the first time, the drug was officially permitted. No more smuggling, no more bribes. It was sanctioned, shielded, and profitable. The Sassoons' wealth exploded. By the 1850s and 1860s, they were running the largest private merchant empire in Asia. They expanded beyond opium into cotton, tea, silk. They opened banks, bought land, invested in railroads and telegraph lines. Every rupee earned from narcotics was pushed into legitimate ventures. And this is how a drug fortune becomes respectable. You don't hide it, you convert it. You build infrastructure, you create jobs. You make yourself indispensable so that when people ask where the money came from, you can point to the schools, the docks, the industries you funded. The drugs fade into the background, an awkward footnote no one wants to examine too closely. And it gets darker. David Sassoon and his sons didn't just sell narcotics, they crafted a legacy. They donated to charities. They funded schools and hospitals. They built libraries and synagogues. His name spread through Bombay not as a drug magnate, but as a philanthropist. In 1847, David Sassoon funded the Sassoon Library and Reading Room in Bombay. It still stands today. In 1861, he financed the Sassoon Dock, which became one of the city's most important ports. He built schools for Jewish children, hospitals, orphanages, and the public looked at the Sassoon name on these institutions and saw generosity, civic pride, pillars of the community. No one asked where the money came from, or if they did, they didn't ask loudly. The British were shielding the Sassoons, elevating them, granting honors. In 1853, David Sassoon became Sheriff of Bombay. Symbolic, but status matters. He was now officially inside the colonial hierarchy. In 1872, his son Abdullah, known as Albert, was made a Knight Commander of the Order of the Star of India, a British title awarded to a merchant whose fortune came from drugging China. In 1873, Albert became the first Jew ever granted the freedom of the City of London, an honor even the Rothschilds hadn't received. The Sassoons were now more respectable than the Rothschilds. Think about that. This is how you clean a drug empire. You don't hide it, you spotlight it. You put your name on everything. You donate so visibly that questioning the source becomes impolite, and you tie yourself so tightly to the ruling system that criticizing you becomes an attack on the empire itself. The Sassoons understood this instinctively. Every school, every dock, every library, why, it wasn't just charity, it was insurance. It bought silence. It shaped the record so that future generations saw benefactors, not traffickers. And it worked. To this day in Mumbai, Sassoon buildings are landmarks. Tourists photograph them. Historians preserve them. Almost no one mentions the opium. Then, in 1949, the Chinese Communist Party won the Civil War and took control of the mainland. One of their first moves was to nationalize all foreign assets. Every building Victor Sassoon owned, every company, every investment, seized overnight without compensation. He lost everything overnight. Over $1 billion in today's terms wiped out instantly. Victor fled Shanghai with whatever liquid wealth he could move and escaped to the Bahamas. The Sassoon Empire in China, a century in the making, was finished, completely erased, and the irony was brutal. The family that built its fortune addicting China was now expelled by a government that rose to power promising to end foreign exploitation. The Communist Party used the memory of the Opium Wars and the memory of foreign merchants like the Sassoons hollowing out Chinese society as propaganda to justify its revolution. The Sassoons didn't just lose assets. They became a symbol of everything China rejected. Meanwhile, in England, the original Sassoon firm was falling apart. By 1939, the family's direct involvement was gone. The company limped on under hired managers, a shadow of what it had been. The opium trade was long dead. The textile business was collapsing. Investments were being sold off. And by the 1980s, the British government declared 2 former partners unfit to serve as directors, an official ruling. The remnants of an empire that once controlled most of the global opium trade ended not in violence, but in administrative disgrace. The buildings remain, the docks, the libraries, the hospitals, still standing in Mumbai, but the family is gone, scattered, forgotten. The name Sassoon means nothing to most people today. A few historians remember, a few economists study them, but they're not spoken of like Rockefellers or Rothschilds. They've been erased from public memory. And here's the pattern. Drug empires never last. They generate fortunes, they corrupt institutions, they shatter lives, but they collapse. Because the market shifts, the state intervenes, or the dynasty burns itself out. The Sassoons made billions in modern terms. They shaped India. They addicted China. They built infrastructure that survives, and within 3 generations, they disappeared. The Sacklers are following the same arc. Purdue Pharma declared bankruptcy in 2019. The family surrendered some assets, about $4.5 billion. Museums stripped their name. The Louvre removed it. Tate Britain removed it. The Met distanced itself. They're being exiled socially. But here's the key detail. $4.5 billion out of roughly $20 billion in total wealth. They kept $15 billion. Most of the fortune still exists, shielded in offshore trusts, hidden in legal structures, spread among relatives untouched by Purdue's operations. The family was held accountable just enough to make headlines, but not enough to lose everything. And the next generation will resurface under new names in new industries, because that's how these dynasties survive. They don't vanish, they dissolve, reform, adapt. Look at the wider pharmaceutical world. Johnson & Johnson sued for its role in the opioid crisis. They produced the raw ingredients for opioid drugs. They knew where their materials were going. They knew prescriptions were exploding far beyond medical need. They did nothing. McKesson, AmerisourceBergen, Cardinal Health, the big 3 distributors, they shipped billions of opioid pills into tiny towns. They had data showing pharmacies ordering impossible quantities. They shipped anyway. And every one of these companies is still operating, still profitable. They paid fines, billions collectively, but they kept going because the system protects them. The opioid epidemic killed more than 500,000 Americans, and the companies responsible paid a fraction of what they earned and continued business as usual. That isn't accountability. That's a line item. It's the same model the Sassoons used. Extract maximum profit. When pressure comes, pay a fine, make a donation, pivot. The Sassoons shifted from opium to real estate. Modern pharma shifts from opioids to new drug classes. Same blueprint, same outcome. So what's the takeaway? First, respectable institutions are often built on blood money. When you see a family name on a hospital wing, ask where the fortune came from. When you see philanthropy praised, look at the business beneath it. Charity is how power launders itself. The Sassoon Library in Mumbai is beautiful. It still serves the public, but it was built with drug money. That doesn't erase the building. It reframes the legacy. Second, state-backed drug empires are legal until suddenly they aren't. The Sassoons operated within the law. Purdue Pharma operated within the law. Both were protected until public outrage became impossible to ignore. The system doesn't stop drug empires. It profits from them until the cost becomes too high. And when that moment comes, it doesn't dismantle the empire. It just forces a pivot. Third, the same playbook repeats endlessly. Industrialize addiction, maximize profit, donate to respected institutions. Wait until the bodies pile up, declare bankruptcy or retire. Let the next generation inherit money no one questions. This isn't ancient history. It's happening now. Opioids in the 2000s, benzodiazepines today, ADHD medication, dependence, antidepressant withdrawals as severe as the conditions they're meant to treat. Every decade brings a new drug, a new market, a new form of dependency disguised as medicine. Fourth, follow the money in any crisis. The Sassoons made billions, but they weren't alone. British banks financed the opium trade. British insurers covered the cargo. British manufacturers built the ships. Ports processed the freight. Officials taxed it. The entire imperial machine profited. And the same structure exists now. The Sacklers made $20 billion, but distributors made fortunes shipping pills. Pharmacy chains made fortunes selling them. Doctors made fortunes through kickbacks and speaking fees. FDA officials who approved the drugs made fortunes when they left government for pharma boards. Purdue wasn't the whole crisis. It was the entire medical industrial ecosystem, top to bottom, all collecting a share, and all still running. Fifth, modern healthcare is built on substances that create long-term dependency, not conspiracy. Business model. Antidepressants taken for years. ADHD medications creating lifelong patients. Pain management turning into chronic use. Diabetes, blood pressure, cholesterol drugs taken for life. The system has shifted from curing disease to managing it indefinitely because lifelong management creates lifelong customers. The Sassoons addicted China with opium. Modern medicine calls it treatment, but the economics are the same. Create dependency, guarantee repeat customers, extract profit for decades. History shows the pattern clearly. Drug empires rise with state support, profit from mass addiction, and buy legitimacy through philanthropy. These empires break apart, sometimes from internal collapse, sometimes from outside pressure. And when they dissolve, they leave behind 2 things: buildings with their names and graves filled with their victims. The Sassoons helped build modern Mumbai. Millions still use the infrastructure they funded. They also helped destroy millions of Chinese lives. Both are true. And the same will be said about today's pharmaceutical giants. They funded research, built hospitals, created treatments that genuinely helped people, and they also killed hundreds of thousands through greed and negligence. Both realities will sit side by side. The Sassoons were once called the Rothschilds of the East. Praise then, a warning now, because every empire built on addiction eventually falls. The only question is how much damage it inflicts before collapse and whether anyone is ever truly held accountable. History suggests no. David Sassoon died wealthy and honored in 1864. His sons inherited titles and fortunes. Albert Sassoon died a knight of the British Empire. Their names live on in buildings and archives remembered for philanthropy, not opium. The Sacklers won't face full accountability either. They paid settlements, yet kept most of their wealth. They've been pushed out of polite society, but remain billionaires. And 50 years from now, their descendants will be funding new institutions while the world forgets the opioid deaths. Time buries bodies and polishes legacies. And the next family running the same scheme is already being praised as visionaries. They're funding research, endowing universities, building museums, and somewhere in their portfolio is a drug or a treatment that creates dependency and siphons wealth from human suffering. The formula never changes. Make your fortune off suffering. Donate enough to buy silence. Let time turn your crimes into history. By then, you're gone. Your family is rich. And the buildings with your name stand as monuments to generosity, not memorials to the bodies you left behind.